Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
All right, welcome to April and our first video for that month. This video is actually a little bit late for an event that happened yesterday because the bearded historian decided it was important. It's somewhat interesting, but I don't know how important it is. That is interesting, so that's something anyway. We have a rocket race, and you'll see why here in a little bit. Are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I'll support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today. All right. There's She Stole. There's Hiking Ontario. There's Northern Woman. There's Ian. There's Amanda. There's Day's Adventures. There's Debbie. There's Popcorn. There's Sea Tripping. My Linda. Rowdy. Muncie. Tammy. There's Carnival. There's Josie. Blistering. Bobby. Peach. Zoll. Eric. Rock. Let's see here. Bobby. There's Neo. Nio. There's Hillbillies. There's Mark. There's Griselda. There's Patty. There's Glitter. There's Keep Digging. Strong-Minded. Principal, and it looks as Ian. Hold on a minute. All right, this is Mr. Ian, and as you can see, he's a vlogger in another language, but he does a lot of lives. Here's some shorts of travel and family outings, and then, of course, some regular videos of family birthdays and greetings, and so it's a vlog of sorts. If you like other countries, other cultures, or vlogging, please check them out. Like, share, comment. Have a good day. Bop.
Bop.
All right. Teacher, Mr. Historian, tell them something interesting. Maybe they'll learn something.
This, maybe. Now, class, you know I like to play with history. You know I like to talk military. You know I like to throw dates at you. So, and this is not an April Fool's joke, as much as some people like to enjoy those sorts of things, which I do too. But this particular episode in our history, if you will, took several decades to come to fruition. The initial idea that we had, and growing up outside of Ellsworth Air Force Base, our huge multi-million-dollar complex just to the north and east of us, was part of an operation that involved several stages of defense. We had deployed out here interceptors that their primary objective would be is to shoot down incoming targets, bombers strategically. They would take and have radar systems up to either scramble planes or, as the need started to increase, they also had what were known as the Nike systems. And our base here, Ellsworth, had 4 brackets of these. As time and the efforts went by, there also was another branch of the military who came up with the idea of Titan missiles. And Titans were not a bad system, but they were not, shall we say, a really big, impressive unit, because they were also prone to accidents. Fuel leakage, accidents of just getting hit with the wrong type of socket could rupture a tank, and they had episodes down in Arkansas, where literally a warhead was blown off the missile. Tons of fun. Up here by Newell, they had another case where the warhead actually fell off the rocket.
Oops.
Down into the silo, and they radioed to a guy at the base to come up with a truck, and they managed to load the warhead into a carriage, lift it out, and take it back to Ellsworth. But I digress. They've had problems with rockets, but the last couple stages that they've had, primarily the main things that they looked at, for example, with the B-52s, was the idea that if they started launching rockets, we had bombers, and we had submarines. We had the trident of options to strike back, and it mutually assured destruction was a good way to put it. You know, if all else failed, these two sides could wipe each other out. Now, today's date, April the 1st, deals back to a time when up in North Dakota, they actually had a place called Nakoma where they had built a complex that was called Safeguard, the Stanley R. Mickelson Safeguard Complex, and it became active on the 1st of April. Now, the big thing to think about with this complex, again, going back to our buddies with Nike, the Zeus project, was that all the way back to 1955, they were working on a system that would work on surface-to-air missiles, improving the radars and computers, and that way, if they could pick up the re-entry vehicles, they could try to shoot down a missile. Kind of makes sense. It's a lot easier and a lot faster than trying to scramble jets to intercept a missile coming in. And that way also the radars could develop tracking information while still leaving enough time for the interceptor missile to climb to the altitude. The Zeus, however, had a limited traffic handling capabilities. It was designed to deal with a small number of attacking missiles arriving over a period as long as an hour out. I don't think the Canadians were thrilled with the idea of us shooting down nuclear missiles over their property for some reason. I don't know why. It was calculated that an attack of only 4 missiles arriving within 1 minute would allow one of the warheads to pass by while the system was busy attacking others, making it relatively easy to attack the Zeus base. However, in an era where ICBMs cost about the same as a strategic bomber, such an attack would cost an enormous amount. Well, through the late 1950s, this new generation of much lighter thermonuclear bombs cut warhead weight from about 6,600 pounds in the case of the original, Soviet ICBM to perhaps 2,200, a little over a ton. Further reductions were known to be possible. For example, we had the Polaris, which only weighed 730 pounds, so smaller rockets could carry these new warheads, same range, greatly reducing the cost of the missile, making them far cheaper than bombers or any other delivery system. Well, one of our favorite throwing a temper tantrum leaders, Nikita Khrushchev, angrily boasted that the Soviet Union was producing new missiles like sausages.
Was it?
The U.S. responded by building more ICBMs of our own, rather than attempting to defend against them with the Zeus. Adding to the problems, the warhead weight dropped. Existing missiles had leftover throw weight that could be used for various radar decoys, which Zeus proved unable to distinguish from the actual re-entry vehicles. Well, the Army would calculate that as many as 20 Zeuses would have to be fired to ensure a single incoming missile was destroyed.
Whoops.
So yeah, it basically made the Zeus obsolete. Well, the next problem, Eisenhower and the Kennedy administrations turned to the newly created ARPA to suggest solutions. The ARPA noted that because the decoys were lighter than the actual warhead, that would slow them down more rapidly as they re-entered the lower atmosphere. They proposed a system using a short-range missile that could wait until the warhead was about 30 kilometers in altitude or 100,000 feet, at which point the decoys would be decluttered, desiring to destroy the missile before it was below 20,000 feet in altitude, combined with the 5 miles per second terminal speed of a reentry vehicle, meant there were maybe 2 to 3 seconds to develop a track and shoot interceptor. This would demand the missiles be extremely fast, high performance radars, and advanced computers to sort out the numbers. Now, in '63, Robert McNamara canceled the upcoming deployment of Zeus and announced that money would then instead be provided for research into this new system now known as Nike X. Sounds like a tennis shoe.
Yes.
Construction on this new phased array radar and its associated computer systems began at the MAR site in White Sands Missile Range. The MAR could track hundreds of warheads of the interceptor missiles sent to attack them, meaning the Soviets would have to launch hundreds of missiles if they wanted to overwhelm it. And now the decoys were no longer an issue. The cost exchange ratio fell back to reasonable levels. Now, Nike X was developed the same sort of troubles that the Zeus had before it. In this case, it was ironically due to the Soviets' own ABM system, which is very similar to the Zeus. To ensure that they could defeat it, the U.S. Air Force began equipping their own ICBMs with decoys, which would defeat the Soviets' Zeus-like system. However, concerned that the Soviets would upgrade their system to a Nike X-like performance, they instead began replacing their warheads with lighter ones and carrying 3 of them. That meant for every U.S. missile would require 3 or 6, accounting for redundancy, interceptors. Well, when the same calculations were run for Nike X, it was calculated that they would have to deploy 7,000 Sprint missiles. And the cost exchange was about 20 to 1 in favor of the Soviets. When presented with these numbers, McNamara concluded that deploying Nike X would prompt the Soviets to build more ICBMs, increasing the risk of an accidental war. From this point on, he opposed building a heavy ABM system like Nike X. In spite of these problems, which McNamara repeatedly made public in a series of talks, the Johnson administration was under intense pressure to deploy an ABM system. In 1966, Congress would vote to provide deployment funding for Nike X, although McNamara refused to use it. I'm going to sit there and throw a fit. As the '67 elections approached, it became clear that this was going to be a major election issue. McNamara proposed arms limitations talks with the Soviets to put upper limits on the numbers of ABMs and warheads, but the Glassboro Summit Conference ultimately came to nothing. Well, by late 1967, it was clear the Soviets were not seriously considering limitations and were continuing the development of their own ABM system. In September, Chinese tested their first H-bomb. McNamara and Johnson seized on this as a solution to the problem, and defense against the tiny Chinese fleet was both technically possible and relatively low cost. Deploying the system would mute the ongoing debate, even over the long term, if the option was open to expand the system to Nike X coverage levels in the future. Well, September the 18th, 1967, McNamara announced the Sentinel program with 17 bases covering the United States, along with a total of just under 700 missiles, about 1/10 the number in a baseline Nike X. Well, Nixon, having campaigned that the Democrats were deliberately dragging their feet on the ABM, inherited the system with his election win. He also inherited the massive NIMBY backlash, not in my backyard, that blew up in the late 1968 when the Army chose to deploy the missiles in suburban locations to allow future expansion to be easier. City dwellers could tolerate the idea of an armed rocket attack against bombers going on over their heads.
Yay!
They were less comfortable with the concept of nuclear anti-missiles detonating against incoming missiles at low altitudes. I wonder why.
I can't imagine.
The issue came to a head at a meeting outside Boston where an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 people showed up to express their displeasure in spite of a raging blizzard. Congressmen were flooded by letters from constituents demanding the site to be removed, and Congress was soon threatening to freeze all additional funds to the system. Nixon announced the construction would be delayed while the system underwent a review. Well, the review was completed on March 14, 1969, and announced in a lengthy speech made by Nixon and various DoD advisors. The entire concept was reviewed, all possibilities considered fresh. Among them, the idea of a heavyweight Nike X-like system was considered, but Defense Secretary Marvin Laird apparently came to the same conclusion that McNamara had before him, stating that the protection the system offers simply just didn't justify the cost. He said, when you looking towards city defense, it needs to be a perfect or near perfect system, because as I examined the possibility of even a thick defense of cities, I have found even the most optimistic projections, considering the highest development of the art, would mean we would still lose 30 million to 40 million lives.
Oh, is that all?
Minor trade.
Oh, that seems so reasonable.
However, they disagreed with the concept of a light city defense as well. There was no reason to deploy a system that only worked under contrived circumstances, especially as accepting them as possibilities meant the enemy was ignoring your deterrent. If that was the case, why have the missiles at all? The real issue became ensuring they cannot ignore your deterrent, and that this concept was that Nixon chose. Instead of deploying the ABM system to protect cities, the new deployment would protect the missile bases themselves, ensuring that no limited attack could be contemplated. This did not have to be perfect or even close to it. So when you're talking about protecting your deterrent, it doesn't need to be perfect. It was necessary only to protect enough of the deterrent that the retaliatory second strike will be such magnitude that the enemy would think twice before launching a first strike. So, Safeguard was the two-layer missile system that they looked at. Long-range Spartan missiles would attempt interception outside of the Earth's atmosphere. The missile's long range allowed protection of a large geographic area, and if the Spartan failed to intercept the missile, the incoming offensive missile, the high-performance, high-speed but short-range Sprint missile would attempt an interception within the atmosphere. Now, both used nuclear warheads, and they relied on destroying or damaging the incoming warhead with radiation rather than heat or blast. The Spartan weapon, with a 5 megatons of TNT yield, the Sprint carried a 1 kiloton of TNT. The envision sequence went as follows. The enemy would be detected by the Defense Support Program satellites, sensing the hot infrared exhaust of an ICBM booster. While it's in mid-course, the ballistic missile early warning system radars in the far north would detect the incoming warheads. Well, as the warheads approached, the Safeguard long-range perimeter acquisition radar would detect them, providing filtered information to shorter range, more precise missile site radar. Now, while the incoming warhead came within range of the MSR, the associated computer systems would calculate the intercept trajectories and launch times. Now, plans were made late in the 1960s to deploy Safeguard systems in 3 key locations. The Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, the Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana, and Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota, to protect important strategic weapon assets. However, the Whiteman Air Force Base location was canceled despite the fact that specific missile and radar site locations had already been selected. Construction was actually commenced at the North Dakota and Montana sites, but only the North Dakota site was completed. Remnants of the incomplete PAR system still remain in rural Montana. Now, the Safeguard system consisted of several primary components. Their perimeter acquisition radar, or PAR, the missile site radar, the Spartan missile launchers, the co-located Sprint missile launchers, and the remote Sprint missile launchers. Now the PAR, if you think about it, is like a big satellite dish, a large passive electronically scanning array radar intended to detect the incoming ballistic missile warheads as they crossed over the North Pole region. Potential targets detected by the PAR would then be sent to the missile site radar and the North American Aerospace Defense Command. 2 radar sites were intended to be constructed along the northern border of the United States, again, one in Montana, one in North Dakota. Construction began at both locations, but because of the ratification of the ABM Treaty, only the site at North Dakota was completed. That site near Cavalier, North Dakota, is now operated by the United States Space Force as the Cavalier Space Force Station. Yep.
That's fun.
There's remnants actually of the Montana site east of Conrad, Montana, but have to go investigate. Now, missile site radar is one of the control of the safeguard system and house the computers in the phased array radar necessary to track and hit back the incoming ICBM warheads. The radar building itself was a pyramid structure several stories tall. Construction began in both Montana and North Dakota, but only the North Dakota site is still standing. The MSR complex included 30 Spartan missile launchers and 16 Sprint missile launchers. The remote Sprint launchers were established around the MSR main complex in order to place missile launchers close to their intended targets and thus reduce the flight range to the targets. 4 sites were completed, and they actually still remain there 10 to 20 miles around the MSR complex in Tacoma, North Dakota.
Ooh.
Now, where this also gets into the files of crazy. Again, you think about back when we were messing with the different types of missile systems. We talked about the construction of the Titans, the Minutemen, when they were up here by the base building the Nike site. They built Nikes all over the country. If I remember right, I think they had like 12 of them around Chicago, around New York, around San Francisco. Just, the idea was that if the Russians are going to launch a bomber at us, let's shoot the thing down. Pretty simple. The big thing that is kind of mind-boggling, when they started working on the missile base up there in North Dakota, the Stanley R. Mickelson Safeguard Complex, it alone cost $6 billion in 1975. To give you an equivalency in today's money, that's over $35 billion. Now, again, it got into initial operating capability April 1975. Now, there have been rumors, we heard about this, that it was only online for 1 day.
Woo! That's an April Fool's joke if I ever heard one.
Yeah. Actually,
millions of dollars to do 1 day of work.
Yeah, that sounds like government policy, but not quite. Interestingly enough, it went to full operational capacity on October the 1st, but then on October the 2nd, the House of Representatives voted to decommission the project as they deemed it ineffective. The complex was deactivated on April 1976 after only 6 months of full operational capacity. That's our government for you.
Whee!
We threw all this money into this big concrete piece. Now we're going to decommission it. Interestingly enough, it was purchased first by the Spring Creek Hutterite Colony of Forbes, North Dakota, at auction for $530,000. And in 2020, portions of the property, including the pyramid, were sold to the Cavalier County Job Development Authority for $462,000. The CCJDA intends to build an interpretive historical center, restore the property, and sell or lease the pyramid to a data center or similar business. For those of you who also enjoy seeing some fun stuff on YouTube, you think about some of the AT&T data underground lines that they have in the world around the United States. Lots of fun. But yeah, the data center developer Bit0 Blockchain acquired the pyramid from the CCJDA to restore and renovate the complex and convert it to a data center, with the slated $500 billion going into the project. Bit0 also plans to create an interpretive center for the complex, while the Hutterite colony retains ownership of the remaining property. The site was named for Stanley R. Mickelson, a former commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Defense Command. Now, the other fun little tidbit off of this whole happy chaos that they had. Give me one sec while my information loads. Come on. If you hear a busy signal, that's it going on. There we go. So, but yeah, 50 years ago today was when this complex got its IOC, the initial operating capability. Testing on the data processing system and radars had been ongoing, with equipment readiness date of October the 1st, 1974. Under Operation Green Mittens, Sprint and Spartan missiles were undergoing installation at the missile site radar site, as well as the remote Sprint launcher sites, including installation of the nuclear warheads. So, April 1st came around, and the United States, for the first time, gained an operational nuclear anti-ballistic missile system. Same thing the Russians had been working on around Moscow. 28 Sprints at that time, 8 Spartans went to ready status. Now, again, popular myth surrounding the North Dakota ABM system was that it was only operated for a single day before closing down. In reality, the site possessed operational capability of shooting down incoming Soviet or Chinese intercontinental submarine launched ballistic missiles. Between April 1st, 1975 and February 10th, 1976, the 315-day operation was still very short when compared to the long development time and expense of the system. They'd been working on this thing since the 50s. And as time went forward, they upgraded and they went with different ideas. And you think about all the money that these guys threw around for, on a per missile silo basis. And then in some of the cases, like here in the Dakotas, we had all these missile sites, and when they were done with them, because, by the terms of the treaties, they blew the silos. There goes a few $1 billion. They still have one here in South Dakota that you could tour in, out by Kadoka. There's the one up in North Dakota, and there's one down in Wyoming that we read about, the Quebec one.
Want to see?
Yep, we got to go see that later this summer or this spring. That says that the safeguard system carried a primary purpose of defending the American ICBM field, with the only Grand Forks defense site ever becoming operational. The thought was a missile field that could be reasonably defended against a surprise first strike, strengthened the nuclear deterrence. However, the concept was controversial, and some critics considering ABM an expensive and unnecessary extension of the nuclear arms race. It actually became a point of contention to the Russians, too. They thought it was an escalation. And so when they decided to go into a treaty, that was one of the things that they were not very happy with for some reason. Kind of like when, Reagan started mentioning using Star Wars. Heaven forbid we shoot down the missiles before they get over here.
Not allowed to do that, are we?
No, heaven forbid. Now, the Soviet Union would retain and later upgrade their ABM defense in the Moscow region. The United States stepped away from the Safeguard program in February of '76. Safeguard operations peaked around October 1st, '75 to February 10th, '76, with the 70 Sprint and 30 Spartan missiles ready to use under international treaty. However, the system could be overwhelmed with a saturation attack of more ICBMs and SLBMs, especially those armed with multiple warheads. The same held true, however, for the Moscow defense, that utilized a far less advanced system, an area likely targeted with advanced multiple warhead and avian countermeasures equipped Minuteman IIIs.
Woo.
So now these days, they still have a few nuclear missiles in a few strategic locations. South Dakota, of course, had to shut down all of their active missiles and blew shut a bunch of silos. North Dakota had a number of their warheads, of course, get pulled and silos shut down as well. But that all came to a neat little fruition on April the 1st, 1975. So 50 years into the history to the day. But this has been the Bearded Historian, folks. We will see you next week.
Nah.
Have a good one.